let me, there are folks who can act. There's folks that can pretend. But one of the true tests of a warrior is that you can walk the talk. And what we have today with us is a naval aviator, but he's also graduated from the Navy's Top Gun Fighter School. I think the most important piece is he's got multiple tours in Iraq doing Iraqi Operation Freedom. He is a Marine's Marine. I use that soldier because my background, but he's a Marine's Marine, and he truly is a leader and somebody out in front. Now, so that you know, this is the United States Marine Corps Deputy Commandant for Programs and Resources, Lieutenant General John Jansen. But more importantly is, right now the Commandant's turning to him and saying, you got to help me because we got to fund it. That would be General Dave Behringer, because he wants to completely focus on how do we create greater chaos for the Chinese in multiple dilemmas for them as we approach the future. So without further ado, please welcome General John.
All right, hey, good afternoon. I'll give you a little bit of perspective here, stand up in front of you. I'm actually going to do something that I very seldom do, and I'm going to tie myself to a podium with notes, and I never do that, but we're kind of in a poignant moment here for the Marine Corps in that General Berger took over as Commandant, early fall last year. Before that, he was the Deputy Commandant for Combat Development Integration down at Quantico and had kind of a running head start on some of the things that he thought that we needed to do as your Marine Corps to be able to fight and win in future operating environments. And so very decisive, as you may or may not see or believe, but his Commandant's planning guidance, he came out and it was, he had some thoughts. Some very clear thoughts about what he thought we needed to do as a Marine Corps, and set to work very deliberately in maybe a short period of time or a long period of time, depending on how you look at it relative to where the Chinese and Russians are at. Say probably we're not going fast enough, but set to work with a number of integrated planning teams down at Quantico to try to get after force design. Most of those have finished up. They really all have except for one, and it's the integration IPT. But it's kind of a poignant moment because this is a time where he's got to go through his very deliberate rollout, right? So I'm going to talk off some notes up here. This is the product that the Commandant used to brief SecDef senior leadership in the department, around which his posture statement was formed. I just came here from his testimony with SecNav, acting in CNO with HACD this morning. And then he's going to go and make his office calls to advise members of Congress in terms of what this force design plan looks like by way of divestments and investments. So it's a little bit of a time of kind of careful messaging, shall we say. But in talking to the Commandant, he wanted me to come over here to try to provide you as much perspective as possible, and I'll try and get it through quickly. And I do have some capabilities that I can share with you. Probably I'm not going to share too much by way of divestments and levels of divestments and those kinds of things. But knowing that I'm walking a little bit of a fine line here, when we get to Q&A, I would ask you to feel free to ask unfettered questions, and I'll do the best I can to provide you perspective. So the Commandant really wanted you all to get some sense of perspective. So he came in, Commandant's planning guidance really had 5 priorities, and the number 1 priority was force design on the list, and he made it very clear right off the bat that his number 1 priority absolutely is force design. And he talked, it's really a fundamental review of the very nature of the Marine Corps, quite frankly, going back to our roots. So if you look at his Commandant's planning guidance, he talked about the fact that the United States Marine Corps has always been a critical enabling capability to the United States Navy. Goldwater Nichols came around, it elevated, by way of some authorities, the Commandant as a service secretary, and then, we had Desert Shield, Desert Storm in the early 90s, and then we go 2001 and, yomping around in OEF, and then a deliberate multi-phase land campaign in Iraq in 2003, and then on we go with your Marine Corps really engaged in conventional warfare, in land warfare, multi-phased land campaigns, to say the least, for a good amount of time. So what he says is hey, what we really need to do, given the world that we're living in and the direction that we're headed and the pacing threat, that we need to re-examine going back to our roots. So he really is looking as the Marine Corps as our operating forces. He doesn't want us to use the term operating forces, but really the Fleet Marine Forces as type commanders to maneuvering fleet commanders. So he's developing a Marine Corps with critical enabling capabilities for sea denial and sea control operations in support of naval campaigns in a joint context, where the Marine Corps would develop and field and with exposure events operate inside of contested space, the WES, if you will, and deliver critical enabling capabilities, meaning capabilities so critical that a Joint Force Maritime Component Commander, maneuvering fleet commander, a CSG or SAG commander says, hey, I've got this list of conditions that I need to be set before I poke my nose in there and engage in contested maneuver. I need to have Marines here, I need to have Marines up here, I need to have Marines over my shoulder to set the conditions. Critical enabling capabilities. And we think as we continue to examine some of the roles and capabilities that we could deliver, that this really extends into joint enabling capabilities. So I'm going to kind of convey to you off my notes here, his product is why force design. And the simple matter of the fact, and General Neller, last comment out, was the first to say it, and General Berger reflected it, that the Marine Corps is neither organized, trained, nor equipped really to satisfy the objectives of the National Defense Strategy. And some of those objectives, sustaining joint force military advantage, deterring adversaries, maintain favorable regional balance of power, ensuring common domains remain open and free, and then this is kind of important too, is deliver performance with affordability and speed. Okay, straight out of the NDS, deliver performance with affordability and speed, and meaning speed of delivering the performance, as we all know. But the simple view is based on People's Liberation Army, navies, their current developments and their joint force developments, China in particular, if they are in fact the pacing threat, and they are. If you look at the trajectory, the arc of the trajectory of what they're developing, not just building a bunch of ships, but the way they're able to integrate their capabilities, that there's really, if the Marine Corps stays along the path of our current force development process, there's a serious strategic gap that's going to open for our capabilities over the next 10 years. The Chinese would open up a decisive advantage. And let's say there are some areas, if you look at areas of strategic overmatch, you look at the TS, Joint Military Net Assessment, there's areas there that those areas of overmatch, I think we all know that we used to enjoy and take for granted, have significantly collapsed, and there's some areas that more than just collapsed. So we really need to modernize the Marine Corps. And so again, out of the NDS, some of those modernization key capabilities are joint lethality in a contested environment, C4ISR, forward force maneuver. This is really important. Forward force maneuver to deploy, survive, and operate inside contested space. Advanced autonomous systems and resilient and agile logistics. Okay, and so this is all out of the NDS in areas to which we must go to achieve a force that will fight and win and deliver to our responsibilities in the future. So what were the assumptions? The assumptions, the NDS remains valid. I heard an earlier comment made here that really well crafted. I think there was a lot of power in the way that the NDS was written, and kind of calls a spade a spade. I think there was some value to that. I think it's also important for us. It's a different subject, but people are talking about a little bit of mobilization and harkening back to World War II and so forth. The fact that one of the I think one of the really important things that the NDS did was it really called a spade a spade. It says that, hey, we're really four sides to do only one thing, right? And so, you know, we used to say we could do two things, two MCOs or two major theater operations of war, whatever we want to call them. And then we went through this period of 10 or 15 years, we said we could do one thing and another thing, and that other thing, we tortured ourselves with the language about what that other thing was, right? But now we're saying, hey, we really do one thing at the very time where it's pretty certain that if something happens in the South China Sea, the odds that Putin moves and takes Georgia, more of Crimea, probably won't go into the Baltics, maybe so, maybe no, Article 5, but piles into Northeast Asia as an opportunistic aggressor, pretty good odds, right? Missiles start bottle rockets off the peninsula, and you know, more malign activity in the Levant, Saudi Peninsula, the Maghreb, and so forth. So the fact of the matter is that we have to look very closely at how we are developing the capability to even to do combat replacements, if not to scale. The one thing I would tell you, you know, an earlier speaker talked about the fact that you know, Arthur Herman's book said that, you know, we really didn't reach max capacity or max tilt, you know, until the thing was over. I kind of take exception. That was really World War I. We were really late to need with mobilization in World War I. And we had stuff stacked up on the ports, you know, we sent the boys over there. We were late to the fight, but we helped end it. But we ended up, you know, flying French airplanes and using French and British weapons and driving around in French trucks. So that was kind of the example. If you're going to read that book, Freedom's Forge, and if you know, I saw a lot of heads nodding earlier, if you haven't read it, you really ought to look at just, you know, go in and borrow it and look at the section, and it really happened Dunkirk. You know, this, you know, right now you could look at this 1936 to 1940 all over again in terms of the global context, right? But you know, there was nothing about the malign activity that was going on in the prosperity sphere in Asia. There was nothing that was going on about the Anschluss or the taking of the Sudetenland or even the Blitzkrieg into the Low Countries. It was really when the British Army got backed up on the beaches of Dunkirk and you know, Winston Churchill telegrams FDR. The phone actually wasn't set up at that point in time, but telegrams and said, hey, you know what, we go down, we're the only liberal democracy or liberal society on the planet, and you're going to be all by yourself feeling oh so alone with wolf packs off the east and west coast. And it was really at that time that the dollar a year men and really Big Bill Knudsen kind of inspired leadership to get FDR. And this is really important, is to restructure the incentive framework to be able to get the American business to respond. That's when it happened. So it really happened kind of May, June of 1940. It had already kind of Lend-Lease, already been started a little bit. But those are things they went to cost plus 8%. You know, they redid the amortization schedules from this real onerous 15 to 17-year schedule down to a 5-year payback on investments, which was, you know, ironically a German model at the time. They did, you know, different ways of forming capital. And these are things, matters of policy for national mobilization that we need to think about. Again, we don't have a national mobilization policy really in this country. We kind of do, but it's DHS, a combination of 9/11 and Katrina. So the NDS remains valid. The scenario is China's a pacing threat, and the threat framework used was the DIA assessment of 2028. And the idea is the fiscal environment, the fiscal growth, we're going to be flatlined. And I think we all know it's going to be, you know, there's some chance that it's going to be different than flatline. Not positive, but not flatlined either, right? So in 1965, the discretionary portion of the federal budget was 70%. Right now it's 39%, and 15% of that is interest on the federal debt, which is interesting that that's discretionary. But at any rate, right now we're at 15%. Defense is 15% of the federal budget, and we're going to go down to 12% by 2025. Incredibly pressurized. And so that's from outside the building. Inside the building, we decided brilliantly to modernize the nuclear triad all at the same time, to include NC3. And then we're going to do a lot of different things in space, not just surveil from space. And that those are tens and tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars. So that's kind of where we're at right now. So the idea is, that was one of the assumptions, was fiscal zero growth. So the operating concept is marine operations in support of the Navy's concepts of distributed maritime operations. So that's how the thing is configured, littoral ops in a contested environment, and then kind of an application of that is this expeditionary advance-based operations. So the idea is the Marine Corps with the Navy and the Joint Force remains forward stationed and forward deployed as a contact layer that engages in competition in the mill-to-mill space and other things on a day-to-day basis. But the Marine Corps forward stationed with forward deployed forces cycling through 3 Marine Expeditionary Force out of Okinawa is in fact right now inside the WES, right? So right now they're inside the threat of those capabilities that China can project. And so the operating concept is to build around those service concepts. I would also tell you that a going-in proposition, I'm sure you've all talked about this today, is an assumption that in a world of A2AD, certainly in the Pacific, you can no longer assume assured access to deep draft ports and long runways. And so what that means about forward stationed and forward deployed forces that can maneuver out in sea, out in the commons, outside the WES and be able to aggregate, to be able to distribute, to make it hard to target, and then to aggregate time and place of our choosing with penetration events to deliver capabilities in and out of the WES. And the horizon line is 10 years. What's the impact on the budget? Right now, there will be some impacts that will trace back. Congress is very interested in this right now. They want to know very much about this force design. So as there are divestments, there will be some impacts on this budget. But the real force design in terms of the heft and weight of where we're headed, the activities for divestments and levels of investments will be made clear as we develop POM 22 and then in the PB 22 program. But I will tell you that you can see a lot of the capabilities are resonant right now in what we've been working on, quite frankly, for the last 5 years. So we've been working quite a bit. We started off talking a lot about tactical redistribution, the ability to rearm and refuel MPRA, to reload Navy ships to form a kind of wholesale to retail tactical distribution network inside or just at kind of the nexus between the WES and more permissive operating environments between a second and first island chain construct. So you can see a lot of those, a lot of the capabilities resonant. There's capabilities, some are in the budget, some you can't see, but are in the budget, that have to do with long-range precision fires inside the WES, and a lot of work being done on that. But I'll tell you, I think a lot of the capabilities relative to what you can already see inside the budget has to do with a lot of the kind of the C5I stuff, the ability to provide alternate paths or reinforcing paths for common data inside the WES, to compress kill chains, and especially to be able to provide those services should satellite communications be completely denied. So we tend to start with a very robust satellite layer and then go graceful to not so graceful degradation from degraded to denied. But we're kind of taking a look at it from the ground up. What if you're just completely denied, and from a terrestrial base, what kind of services can you provide? That's where the Marine Corps becomes a little bit more of a critical enabler to the joint force. So bottom line is zero-sum fiscally. We're going to internally generate resources, trade quantity for quality. So that means structure for more modern, capable force, and to reallocate priorities within our budget. Acceptable risk near term for the objective force. So let me talk to you a little bit about maybe some of the capabilities here. So left side of the page here is legacy surge. I'm not going to talk about that. I'll talk broadly about capabilities. No programmatics necessarily involved here. But again, Commandant's product, modern rebalance, so long-range precision fires, anti-surface warfare, organic precision fires, mounted and infantry, manned and unmanned teaming, both long-range lethal UAS and long-range unmanned surface vessels, air defense, resilient PNT, precision navigation timing, C2 modernization, increased capacity for modernized electronic warfare, and then modernized training and education to support it all. So you're going to see some organizational changes within the Marine Corps to do that. And, if you have an interest relative to the capabilities, I would commend you back to the Commandant's War on the Rocks article where he listed some of these a little bit more specifically. Unmanned lethal, low-cost, long-endurance combat aerial vehicles, unmanned lethal and non-lethal ground and amphibious vehicles, unmanned aerial, ground, surface, and underwater logistics vehicles, vessels, mobile, rapidly deployable rocket artillery, and long-range precision fires to include anti-ship missiles. Mobile air defense and counter-precision guided systems to include directed energy systems, loitering munitions, signature management, electronic warfare, expeditionary airfield capabilities, offensive mining capabilities, and lethal and risk-worthy surface vessels to include large undersea vessels. And, to the end of, in a poignant moment here, thought we've been able to come and talk a little bit more about what some of the force design implications are to your nation's naval expeditionary amphibious fleet and what it looks like today and what it might look like in the future. But as I'm sure has been talked about a number of times here, the Secretary of Defense has decided that he's like to take a little bit of a look at that and make sure that we're getting that right. So I'll make a note that the Commandant would want me to tell you that it's very important to say that we will have to continue a campaign of analysis on this, to continue to iterate on this. We've been doing this for quite some time, participating in the Navy's Global Series up at Newport, I participated with Admiral Hitchcock down at the Naval Warfare Development Center down at Norfolk at Day. We had an experiment down there 2 years ago. So we've been doing this for a while in terms of doing the exercise experimentation war games. So he would want me to tell you that that's ongoing. And he really makes a point to say that this will be ongoing anyway, because in the world that we're living in, the pacing threat is just going to continue to evolve. All these emerging technologies that, flow off our tongues like we know what we're talking about, but maybe we don't, and AI and machine learning and quantum. What is quantum really? I think it's starting to come a little bit more into view. You start to see some practical applications, but it's all emerging and it's emerging fast. And so I think, that's part of the risk, is that when this thing goes down, and it will, unfortunately, the history of humankind is the history of warfare and vice versa, is it's going to be fast and it'll go global. And if we only fight China, it's global right off the bat, right? Just because of where they're at right now. So that's it. I think ultimately we see the value of the Navy Marine Corps team here and this is globally applicable. But if you look at the idea that with the proliferation of A2AD, really even with the maturation of it within region, if you look at China and Russia as maturation within zone, so to speak, but then you really look at the proliferation to lots of other places. Just look at S-400s in Syria and that kind of thing. Is that A2AD? To discuss. But the fact of the matter is the more that these areas become contested, the more the value of the commons, right? Large ocean spaces, maneuver space goes up. And so we just need to think about that from a joint context and how we work at that. The last thing I'll tell you is the Commandant would also want me to tell you that the Marine Corps remains really by law, by policy, by direction of the DPG, and by our very ethos to be the nation's force in readiness. Navy Marine Corps team in a joint context to go out there, and that is something that we must remain by direction, but will remain by our ethos because we like to fight, and when we fight, we win. So that's it. That's my presentation. I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Hey, General Jansen, Mike Brogan. So there are a lot of young company-grade combat arms officers, particularly those who drive combat vehicles, who want to know if they're going to have a job after force design is fully rolled out.
Yeah, they absolutely will have a job, and so you're going to see some shifts in types of formations, but what you will see is there are, for example, the advanced reconnaissance vehicle we're developing. CDD is signed on that, and that's really something that we look to be kind of analogous to what people like to say about the F-35, a quarterback, but a quarterback on the ground that really not only has man-unmanned teaming with flying stuff, but also crawling and roving stuff to be able to go out and look for signatures and so forth. And so you'll see some very interesting things along those lines. The ACV program is coming along nicely. You'll see things along those lines. There will be, other kind of modalities in play. But we will remain focused on, very much being marinized and what that means in a future amphibious expeditionary shipping context on what those form factors are and how we can deliver them effectively. But the answer is yes. Sir.
General Ron Perlman from Holland and Knight.
Rod, good to see you.
A simple question.
Uh-oh.
How concerned, if at all, is the Marine Corps about the strategic sea lift capability?
Well, I think we all are, right? So it's a huge hole in really sea lift and airlift. You would say it's a huge hole in our swing. So, I mean, you can start from the top and work your way down, right? So, a commercial shipping fleet, deep draft, ocean-going, flagged and owned shipping fleet that becomes a merchant marine in time of global conflagration. If you look at PRC in Hong Kong, flagged and owned, deep draft, ocean-going vessels, 5,400. We've got about 83, right? And that's not the Ready Reserve Fleet. And then you look at the Ready Reserve Fleet, and the attempts have been done to sally that thing forth, not so much. And so there's big questions about that in terms of lift. I was on the CFLIC staff for the invasion in 2003 out of Camp Doha, and we did a lot of RSO&I for Army Echelon Above Corps Aviation, and so had look at the overall. It wasn't a tip fit, right, but it was force flow. And man, it was like watching paint dry. I mean, it was even back then. You looked at that and you go, uh-oh, that's a little bit of a challenge. But it's not a Marine Corps concern, it's a national concern. And so I think I would tell you, though, the Marine Corps is up front as a blunt force, a gap filler in that sense, forward, station forward deployed, but also with maritime preposition kit that, at least gives, the ability for what the Commandant would tell you is, we've always said, hey, we're a force across the Romo and range of military operations, and that we will remain, but really, the nuance there for a blunt force is our responsibility is to control escalation within the range of military operations. So, that's what we have to be able to slow things down as a joint force, slow things down and create decision space, even more, not even for calculation, strategy, geopolitics, nuclear escalation ladders, that's back in vogue. But even for the movement, the force generation and deployment of forces to the point of contact, point of friction.
Maybe I can ask a two-part question. One is, as the other services seem to be ramping up on end strength, you're looking at reducing in the 2021 about 2,100 Marines. Mm-hmm. So. Is that fit in the, how are you making up that capability gap? The other one is, if you'd like to comment on how you're working with the Army on future vertical lift and where that might go for the Marine Corps. Okay.
We are reducing end strength by 2,300 in PB21, right? So it's really before that. And not formation, so primarily with policy. But some small things, some fleet anti-terrorist support teams that we kind of downsized from 18 to 12 and that kind of thing. But probably we'll have to go to a much more broader examination of that. End strength reductions certainly must be part of the mix if we're going to be able to get at the things and pivot into the kind of capabilities that we need to deliver. And with respect to future vertical lift, I know there's great partnership with the Army on a number of different fronts, and I work routinely with General Pascaret, real gentleman, and so we've got really good partnership and communication in a number of programs that we're working on together. Counter UAS, of course, JLTV, future vertical lift. That's kind of there's a lot of opportunity there, but I think there's pretty good partnership there. The red lights are on.
Well, so that we don't get you dropped in the wrong LZ, as Army Ranger said this morning. I'd like everybody to please give a round of applause for